Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz is a figure that few people know about. But what was the real Queen Charlotte like, and how true is the portrayal of her character in a show like The Bridgertons? How could this woman who became Britain's first queen live in the shadow of her husband, King George III, and how did her personal trials affect the fate of a nation? In this video, we travel back to the 18th century to find out more about a queen who deserves to be remembered as more than just the wife of George III. She became queen consort at the age of 17, had 15 children, and was married to a man who went down in history as the king who lost America and went mad. This is the first queen of the United Kingdom, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, whose story is as full of drama as any novel or film. Princess Sophia Charlotte, known as Charlotte, was born on the 19th of May, 1744 to Duke Charles of Mecklenburg-Strelitz and his wife Elizabeth. She was the fourth of 5 surviving children and grew up in the small German duchy, then considered a province. Her father died when she was 8 and she was brought up by her mother, who gave her a good education. Charlotte was taught by the poetess Madame de Grabeau and Dr. Genzer, who gave her a knowledge of French and Latin, theology, and botany. She was also an excellent seamstress and loved to read. Her Protestant faith also played a part in her marriage to George III. George III became Elector of Hanover and King of Great Britain and Ireland in 1760 at the age of 22 and immediately set about finding a bride. There had been no queen since the death of his grandmother, Queen Caroline, in 1737. George could not marry a Catholic, which severely limited his options, and he had a long list of requirements for his future wife. He wanted her to be young, kind, docile and respectable, not too clever and not too interested in politics. He didn't care much for her looks, which was fortunate, as Charlotte had never been considered a beauty. As she grew older, many unkind comments were made about her appearance. The famous writer and politician Horace Walpole, who saw her in her youth, described her as neither tall nor handsome, pale and very thin, but of a sensible and noble appearance. He noted that her hair was dark and thin, her forehead low, and her nose very good, except that the nostrils were too wide. I will now focus on a subject that will probably interest many, but is not the focus of this video, and that is the color of Queen Charlotte's skin. In fact, Charlotte was white, and any qualified historian who has studied the subject knows this. This video is not about the casting choices for The Bridgertons, nor is it a criticism of those programs or the actresses who have portrayed versions of Queen Charlotte on screen. The Bridgertons is an explicitly fictional program set in an alternate reality where full racial equality was achieved in Britain by the end of the 18th century, which sadly has not yet happened. By 1761, George had chosen Princess Charlotte as his bride, despite his advisors' fears that her upbringing in a small and unremarkable court had not prepared her for her role as Queen Consort of the British Isles. But George was confident that she was young enough to learn, and on the 8th of July he announced his decision to marry her. Charlotte's family happily accepted the proposal in what could be described as a true from rags to riches story. Charlotte arrived in London on the 8th of September and became Queen and Elector of Hanover the same night, after marrying George at St. James's Palace. Their coronation took place on the 22nd. Before George's mental deterioration, their marriage had been remarkably happy. His care in choosing a wife who suited his tastes made their life together harmonious. Everyone who met Charlotte remarked on her serenity, grace, and benevolence. Although she lacked the luxury and refinement expected of a French princess, her sincerity and lack of political ambition made her popular. She converted easily from Lutheranism to Anglicanism and learned the language after her arrival. George immediately proved to be an attentive husband, providing her with a new wardrobe of fashionable English clothes and an impressive array of jewelry so that she could dazzle at any ball. He also proved to be a faithful husband, a rarity among English royalty. The Queen Consort's main task, of course, was to produce an heir, and Charlotte quickly proved herself. She became the most prolific Queen of England, Scotland, and Great Britain, giving birth to 15 children, 13 of whom lived to adulthood. She had no stillbirths and is said to have had very few miscarriages. This birth rate is incredible, especially considering the times in which she lived. Their eldest child was the future George IV, born in 1762, just 11 months after the wedding. He was followed by Prince Frederick, Duke of York in 1763, and William, Duke of Clarence, the future William IV, in 1765. In 1766, Charlotte, Princess Royal, was born, much to the delight of her parents, who had been desperate for a girl. Edward, Duke of Kent, the future father of Queen Victoria, was born in 1767. Next came Princess Augusta in 1768, Princess Elizabeth in 1770, Prince Ernst, Duke of Cumberland in 1771, Prince Augustus, Duke of Sussex in 1773, Prince Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge in 1774, Princess Mary in 1776, Princess Sophia in 1777, Prince Octavius in 1779. As he became Charlotte's eighth boy, Prince Alfred in 1780 and finally Princess Amelia in 1783. The King and Queen were attentive parents by the standards of their day, caring for their children and visiting the nursery frequently. Although Queen Charlotte was an attentive mother, she was not able to spend as much time with her children as she would have liked. Her husband, King George, was more relaxed and would play with the children on the floor while Charlotte was busy with her royal duties. As was customary at the time, the children had nursemaids, governesses, and teachers to care for and educate them. As the boys grew older, their father sent them to separate institutions where they were subjected to strict academic discipline. This led to strained relations between the king and his sons, especially the heir. Charlotte, who was kind and submissive, did not intervene in the situation, and her sons suffered from the harsh teaching methods. However, the girls remained at home and were educated under the guidance of renowned teachers such as the painter Thomas Gainsborough and the musician Johann Christian Bach. Outside of childcare, the Queen's days were filled with social engagements and meetings with her husband. Charlotte attended theatres, enjoyed walks in London's parks, and organised concerts at her home where she and other members of the royal family played instruments. She and George also enjoyed reading, which became a shared passion. Despite their closeness, their relationship was rather isolated. George did not want Charlotte to mix with the local aristocracy, fearing it might influence politics. The royal ladies appointed to her court were much older than she was, and the language barrier only made things more difficult. Charlotte relied on her friend Juliana Schwellenberg, who had traveled with her from Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Despite her unpopularity at court, Juliana remained close to Charlotte until her death. Charlotte and George's relationship was unusual for the time. They slept together, which was not common for married couples of their rank, and this gave the impression of deep affection. However, had they lived in modern times, this behavior might have raised questions about control and dependency. The Duke of Gloucester, George's brother, later remarked that the king was delighted to have an impressionable and malleable 17-year-old to bend to his will. He was determined to ensure that she was totally devoted to him and had no other friends or company. This certainly had a negative effect on Charlotte. In time, she wrote to her brother of a dull, highly regimented and withdrawn life full of unhappiness, although she kept her feelings carefully hidden from others in England and rarely showed strong emotions. Charlotte was nothing like the one we see in the Bridgerton series, where she is portrayed as stubborn and even mischievous. The couple first lived in St. James's Palace, but soon acquired one of the most famous royal houses. Tired of the dilapidated state of St. James's, George bought Buckingham House in 1762, which soon became known as the King's House. In 1775 it was formally handed over to Charlotte by Parliament. Today, of course, it is the famous Buckingham Palace, the centre of the monarchy. Later, after the death of George's mother, they also took over her home in Kew and renovated Windsor Castle and its surroundings for their use. Charlotte admitted that she did not like moving between the three houses, but, as always, she obeyed her husband's wishes and tolerated it. The Queen was active in charity work and supported many hospitals, schools, and orphanages, including the famous Magdalen Hospital in London. As mentioned above, George wanted her to stay out of British politics, but some scholars argue that the Queen's views on ministers may have influenced those of her husband. Also, as Electress of Hanover, Charlotte was a little more involved, especially when her brother became military governor there. However, there were issues that were difficult for the Queen to ignore, and the American Revolution was one of them. I won't go into the history of the Revolution, as it's not the main subject of the video, but basically between 1775 and 1783, 13 British colonies were lost and became part of the modern United States. When George was offered a compromise to retain significant control over the colonies and give them more autonomy, he chose the path of total domination. Although he was a constitutional monarch, he still had considerable influence over government decisions that had to be approved by him. Far from being powerless, he became associated with a long and costly war, partly due to his unwillingness to modernize the administration of the colonies. This severely damaged his reputation on both sides of the Atlantic, and he is now remembered as the king who lost America. For Charlotte, this meant living with an even more overworked and stressed husband. In 1783, George even considered abdicating and moving to Hanover with her and the younger children, but was dissuaded. The death of 2-year-old Prince Alfred in 1782 added to the unhappiness of the royal family. The usually reserved Charlotte wept bitterly. Then, 8 months later, her 4-year-old son Octavius died suddenly, possibly of a cold he caught after his father took him out in the garden in the evening. He had only been ill for 48 hours, and the shock of losing him was immense. Both parents were devastated, especially George, who was very fond of Octavius. Charlotte spoke for many years of her bitterness at the loss of her sons. The early 1780s proved unhappy, and sadly the situation only worsened. Now an adult, the Prince of Wales was a constant source of worry and embarrassment to his parents, carrying on scandalous affairs with married women and appearing in the newspapers for the most unflattering reasons. His relationship with both his parents deteriorated as the King and Queen severely rebuked him for his actions. Apart from their second son, Frederick, they had poor relations with the other boys, who were scattered across Europe and sometimes North America, kept under strict financial control and sometimes not even receiving answers to their letters. How George and Charlotte thought they were building a strong and loving royal family is unclear. As for the princesses, they stayed at home and were often bored because their father refused to find them suitors. George seemed to think he was protecting them from the world and did not want to separate them, so his daughters had little contact with anyone outside the royal court. Charlotte did nothing to change the situation, not wanting to upset her husband either, and things continued as they were. But their lives were soon to be turned upside down by one of the most famous events of the reign, the so-called madness of King George. In the summer of 1788, the normally healthy George III suddenly fell ill with what he described as bilious complaints. The problem subsided and his doctor advised him to go to Cheltenham to improve his health. He made the journey, taking Charlotte and his 3 elder daughters with him. The trip seemed to do him good, but on his return in August his health deteriorated again. He began to complain of a rash, and within a few weeks his condition deteriorated rapidly. In addition to fatigue and severe stomach pains, which sometimes made it difficult for him to breathe, he became increasingly agitated, mumbling for hours on end about various subjects until his voice became hoarse and he sometimes frothed at the mouth and burst into tears. Charlotte initially tried to contain her emotions and maintain an atmosphere of calm in the royal household, but as the situation worsened she began to lose her balance. Doctors could not work out what was wrong, although they suggested, unconvincingly, that it might be gout, which explained his physical symptoms. King George began to see red spots when he read, had difficulty hearing music and became obsessed with Charlotte's safety. The sons were summoned to a family dinner at Windsor Castle to assess the situation. The dinner went horribly. The king, in an extremely upset state, said many inappropriate things, going so far as to push his eldest son against the wall in front of everyone in a fit of rage. The family wept. Charlotte fled to her chambers, but the king followed her and made her lie down on a couch in a neighboring drawing room. She was only able to go to bed when, after several hours, he finally retired to his bedroom. But even there she found no peace, listening to his mutterings until he burst back into her room. Francesca Burney, who lived at court, described the king's condition as a madness. She saw the normally reserved Charlotte crying the next morning, while the king continued to talk excitedly to the doctors. There were later rumors that the king had attacked Charlotte and Princess Royal, but these are difficult to confirm. The situation had reached a breaking point. The Prince of Wales took control of the situation by bringing in new doctors without the mother's knowledge. Charlotte was asked to move to another apartment so as not to upset the king. Her relationship with her son was strained, she felt superfluous, and after the move she sobbed and asked, "What is going to happen to me?" Meanwhile, George became increasingly upset and aggressive at being separated from his wife and daughters. He was not eating or sleeping well. It seemed that he would either go mad or die. Today, the most common version of the king's illness is porphyria, but in the late 18th century it was unknown, and many historians and doctors dispute this diagnosis, suggesting bipolar disorder. Whatever the diagnosis, the illness lasted for months and caused the Queen great distress. At times, the king seemed to improve, only to relapse into a state described by eyewitnesses as delirium, frenzy, and even convulsions. At the end of November he was moved from Windsor to Kew with Charlotte and his daughters. When he was finally allowed to see her, he claimed that he had never loved the Queen and had been unfaithful to her with the Countess of Pembroke, one of her ladies-in-waiting. Charlotte visibly lost weight, became depressed, and her hair turned grey. As early as November, the Prince of Wales was considering a regency because of the king's incapacity. However, the agreement proposed by the government in December severely restricted his powers, leading to a serious conflict with Charlotte. He accused her of supporting her husband's rights as king, should he recover, and the government of William Pitt. At the end of January 1789, however, the king suddenly began to recover. A fortnight later he was declared well enough to prevent the passing of the Regency Bill. From Charlotte's point of view, disaster had been averted, but, as we shall see, not forever. She found it hard to forgive the Prince of Wales and her second son Frederick, who sided with his brother, for not supporting her and George during this difficult time. According to some researchers, her personality changed forever. She became more rigid, less cheerful and irritable, and could not forget the humiliation and bitterness of being rejected by George and claiming to love Lady Pembroke. This soured her relationship with her daughters, which never recovered. Nevertheless, life at court soon returned to normal. George's popularity increased after his recovery, and this was particularly important because in 1789 the French Revolution began, which eventually led to the execution of the King and Queen of France, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The British royal family needed all the support they could get. But it wasn't long before another scandal broke, this time involving princes. In December 1785, the Prince of Wales entered into an illicit union with the widow and Catholic Mary Fitzgerbert, although this fact was denied for many years. Because of her religion, the union violated a law forbidding such marriages for the heir to the throne. In addition, a 1772 law forbade a prince to marry without his father's consent before the age of 25, so this marriage was considered invalid. The young Prince Augustus also entered into an illicit union with Lady Augusta Murray in 1793, which was officially recognized as invalid in 1794, and their son remained illegitimate. Such a start to the married life of Charlotte's children did not bode well, and the situation was exacerbated when the Prince of Wales decided to marry legally. On the 8th of April, 1795 he married his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. This turned out to be a disaster. Prince George did not bother to find out about his bride's character, thinking only of the money he would receive from Parliament for the marriage. Charlotte, who knew about her niece, was against the match but could do nothing to stop it. When they met for the first time, the prince ordered brandy on the pretext that he was ill, and Caroline called him fat, remarking that he was not at all as handsome as in his portrait. Both were reluctant to continue the ceremony, but it was too late. The Prince and Princess of Wales had only one daughter, Princess Charlotte, named after her grandmother, who was born almost exactly 9 months after the wedding, on the 6th of January, 1796. Her parents separated a few days later, and their separation became official the following year. Charlotte could only watch the unhappiness of her son and his wife, unable to do anything about it. She increasingly hated her public role and complained about how badly she was received by the press, despite her best efforts to fulfill her duties. She also refused to help her unfortunate daughters escape this royal hell. However, the eldest of the daughters was eventually freed through the persistent wooing of Frederick, the Duke's widower. In May 1797 the Princess Royal married and moved to the duchy. Charlotte was sad because everyone realized that they would never see each other again. Charlotte later decided that she did not like her son-in-law, who was constantly asking the king for political help. However, the princess was happy that she was finally free from living with her parents and sisters. As for Charlotte's other daughters, they continued to live at home, but their lives were filled with tragedy and scandal. By the late 1790s, it was clear that the health of the youngest, Princess Amelia, was failing due to tuberculosis. But it was her sister Sophia who caused the most concern. Although some argue that it never happened and was merely a smear against the princess, the facts are that in the summer of 1800 she gave birth to an illegitimate son by one of King George's courtiers. The child was initially left with a local tailor and his wife, but Major General Thomas Garth soon took the boy, also named Thomas, to live with him. This was a real disgrace to the royal family. However, an attempt was made to cover it up and Sophia was removed from public view before the baby was born. Charlotte made no comment about the incident, except to mention in passing that Sophia's health was better. But of course she was terribly saddened, as it wasn't the first time one of her children had been at the center of a scandal, especially against the backdrop of her son's reputations and failed marriages. The following year Charlotte faced two major changes in her life. The first, though minor, occurred in early 1801. The Act of Union between Great Britain and Ireland was passed and she became the first Queen of the new United Kingdom. The second was what she had feared so much. In February the King's mental problems had escalated again. He looked mad, as they said at the time. He had a fever, and in early March he even slipped into a coma. Everyone feared he would die, but fortunately he regained consciousness a few days later. But he was still not himself, and Charlotte was afraid to be alone with him, remembering what he had been like in 1788. This made their relationship very difficult as she tried to avoid him whenever possible, and the situation reached an extreme when he sneaked into her room on the night of the 16th of April. We don't know exactly what happened, but this, along with the sudden appearance of the king and perhaps the king's unhealthy interest in his sister-in-law's niece, the Princess of Wales, was enough for Charlotte to ask for him to be imprisoned again. This, as Hadlow explains, was an extraordinary step for a woman who had been obliged to do his bidding and protect his interests since the age of 17. He was detained at Kew for a month until he declared that he would not carry out his duties unless he was released. He was eventually released, but he was still not of sound mind and blamed Charlotte in part for his imprisonment. It was difficult for the family to be around him, but there was little that could be done. Eventually things calmed down, but in 1804 the illness returned. This time it lasted several months. Despite this, George was allowed to live his life as usual, although his manic energy and cruelty to his family affected everyone. Charlotte's marriage, once close and happy, crumbled under the pressure of his mental problems. He became suspicious and violent, making rude remarks about other women in her presence and openly saying which woman he wanted to make his mistress. According to the Princess of Wales, he even tried to harass her during his unwanted visits. His daughters were also victims of his unwanted attentions and were no longer allowed to ride in the coach with him. This behavior further upset and humiliated the Queen, and she refused to sleep with him anymore, which is understandable. It seems that the romantic and amorous side of their marriage was over. Even when George recovered, they stopped sleeping together and only met in public to keep up appearances. They lived in separate houses, and the king openly criticized his wife. Considering how happy they had been before, this turn of events was a real tragedy for Charlotte. While we can sympathize with her, it is worth noting that Charlotte could be selfish. In 1808 she steadfastly refused to support a proposal of marriage to her daughter Elizabeth from the Duke of Orleans, even though it would have made the princess happy. Had Charlotte supported it, it might have been possible despite the Duke's Catholic faith, especially if she had agreed to give up her claim to the throne. Nor did she support Princess Amelia's relationship with Charles Fitzroy, another royal courtier, or help her daughters find suitable suitors. The king himself admitted that he did not seek husbands for his daughters because he wanted to keep them close to him, and Charlotte seemed to share this view. The rejection of Amelia's happiness had ruined their relationship, and it was particularly bitter knowing that the young woman didn't have much time left. She suffered from tuberculosis and died in 1810, aged just 27. Charlotte was now in the last decade of her life. The king had reigned for 50 years, and they had been married almost as long, but their marriage was crumbling by the day. The king had gone blind, and their surviving children were often unhappy and resentful. Their problems were not over, and the next blow was the final deterioration of the king's mental state. By the time of Amelia's death, George was again beginning to succumb to his old illness, and this time there was no recovery in sight. The Regency Amendment was passed, and on the 6th of February, 1811, the future George IV officially became Prince Regent. Soon after the king became regent, Charlotte's life changed. She had to look after her husband, but he was already completely out of touch with reality, often talking to their deceased children and even imagining that he was married to Lady Pembroke. Charlotte felt depressed and could no longer be patient and kind to him after all the trials. The doctors even begged her to show him more kindness. As time went on, she visited him less and less, leaving his care to her daughters, but their influence over her gradually diminished. To reduce royal expenses when the king could no longer perform his duties, his court was reduced and Parliament offered Charlotte the substantial sum of £50,000 a year. This was a lot, but not enough to maintain her usual lifestyle. Her daughters were offered £9,000 a year each, giving them the opportunity to become financially independent. Charlotte was against this as it meant she would lose control over them. Many of her old servants left or were sacked, and the daughters began to run their own lives, which upset Charlotte and led to a breakdown in their relationship. Her granddaughter, Princess Charlotte, also showed no interest in her grandmother and disliked visiting her, but this changed when she supported her decision to break off her engagement to the Prince of Orange. However, Charlotte was to suffer another tragedy. In 1816, Princess Charlotte married Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, but after several miscarriages, she gave birth to a stillborn son and soon died of complications from childbirth, aged just 21. This was a terrible blow to the whole family, and Charlotte was in deep mourning. Princess Mary finally married her cousin, the Duke of Gloucester, in 1816, and although still an important figure in the family's life, she no longer lived with them. In 1818, Prince Frederick unexpectedly asked for Princess Elizabeth's hand. At first Charlotte did not object, but on reflection she realized that she did not want another daughter to go to Germany forever. Elizabeth did not change her mind, and the wedding took place. They never met again as Charlotte was nearing the end of her life. The tragedy of losing her granddaughter took a heavy toll on Queen Charlotte's health. In the summer of 1818, traveling from London to Windsor, she had to stop and rest at Kew. Sadly, it was to be her last stop. Suffering from heart failure, she died a slow and agonizing death as fluid built up in her body and she found it difficult to breathe. At this difficult moment the Prince Regent held her hand, and she died on the 17th of November, 1818, aged 74. Charlotte was buried in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, where her husband was later laid to rest after his death in 1820. So how can we characterize Queen Charlotte? She had many admirable qualities. She had an incredible sense of duty and loyalty to her husband and her country. In the early decades of their marriage, she always put her own needs second to George's wishes. Charlotte was intelligent, calm and dignified, showing patience and grace in difficult situations involving her husband's illness. But she was also sympathetic, having a possessive and controlling husband who prevented her from expressing herself and making meaningful friendships in her youth. At the same time, she was not very good at showing affection and often jeopardized the happiness of her daughters, preventing them from building their own lives and happiness, just to keep them in a state of unhappiness. As she grew older, her temper became increasingly volatile and most family members avoided interacting with her. Despite this, she went down in history as a record breaker. She had more children than anyone else, became the first Queen of Great Britain and, until Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was the longest-lived woman in the history of England, Scotland and Great Britain. She also became Queen of Hanover in 1814 when the country became a kingdom, but never visited. In summary, Charlotte's life was full of contradictions. She was a devoted wife and mother, but at the same time her actions often jeopardized the happiness of her daughters. Despite all the difficulties, she left her mark on history and became a symbol of an era in which the royal family faced new challenges. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and share your thoughts. What do you think of Charlotte's role in the lives of her children? Do you think her actions were motivated by caring or selfishness? Let's discuss it in the comments.